Okay, we're going to get started. So if you have not gotten a drink or a snack, now is the time to do that, and then come take a seat. And we're going to jump into the study this evening. If you do not have a copy of the handout, we have a few extra copies. You want to just raise your hand and David will get it to you? Does anyone? One? Great. Welcome to our last week of Ruth together. This is our 5th week, our final week. Thank you guys for taking the time to come and be a part of this study. It's been so fun for David and I to study alongside you. And I also just wanted to thank you guys for participating. The style of this study is so much better when people are willing to jump in, whether it's sharing with someone sitting next to them, sharing corporately. So yeah, just thank you for really being willing to participate. It's what makes the study fun. We've learned a lot from you guys and alongside you guys in this study. It's one of the reasons that this is probably my favorite style of study because we get to learn from each other and just the different perspectives each of us are bringing to the text. When you guys are sharing your thoughts, I'm learning something new. And a lot of times, different people, different personalities, we're seeing just a different lens of the text and maybe picking up on things that I wouldn't have seen on my own. So thank you guys so much for making the study what it has been. We are going to not only be finishing chapter 4 tonight, but also wrapping up the book as a whole. And so for that reason, we're just going to jump right in. So as always, we're going to start with prayer. This is how we start all of our Bible studies. So if you would join me, let's pray. Lord, we thank you so much for another opportunity to get together with brothers and sisters and sit down, open up your word, study it together, and then talk about how this book can change our life. I thank you for each and every person who's here tonight, watching online. I just pray that as we study, that we would have just a transformed heart and mind, and that we would walk away with a greater understanding of your word, a better picture of your character and your nature, and that we would look more like you. I pray these things in your name. Amen. All right, so hopefully by now you guys are familiar with the steps of our Bible study. We tried to keep them pretty consistent week to week so that you can take these steps, do them at home, do them with a friend. We're going to be in our final chapter of Ruth tonight, which is Ruth Chapter 4. When we left off the story last week, Ruth had just returned home in the early hours of the morning after her somewhat scandalous night on the threshing floor with Boaz, which we all discussed last week. It was a great discussion. And she has related to Naomi everything that's happened. And after sharing the details, Naomi responds by assuring her that we are not going to have to wait long to see the resolution. And the way she puts it, I really like. She says at the end of chapter 3, the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today. So for someone who was here last week, what is the matter that's being settled in chapter 4? What was the tension that chapter 3 left off with us in? There's another redeemer. And at this point, we are biased. We want Boaz and Ruth to end up together. We are not interested in another redeemer. We want Boaz. So chapter 3 ends off with there's another man closer in relation to you, and we have to talk to him first. And so that's where chapter 3 ends off. So we're going to pick up the story in chapter 4, which is in page 7 of your handout. As I read, I just want to encourage you, if you have a pen or a pencil, get it out. And as I read, if you're noticing something that's standing out to you, you can go ahead and mark it in this first reading. Ruth chapter 4. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there. And behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. Then he said to the Redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me, that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it. And I come after you." And he said, "I will redeem it." Then Boaz said, "The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance." Then the Redeemer said, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it." Now this was the custom in former times of Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other. And this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself," he drew off his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and to Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day." Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because the offspring of the Lord will give you by this woman." So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron, Hezron fathered Ram, Ram fathered Amminadab, Amminadab fathered Nahshon, Nahshon fathered Salmon, and Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed, Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David. All right, that's Ruth chapter 4. Step 3, this is genre, and at this point, you guys are well aware that we are studying a historical narrative. So the book of Ruth is written in this style. That means that in the past few weeks, we've focused a lot on characters, setting, plot, conflict, resolution. And here in chapter 4, we're actually at the place of resolution. The conflict that started, the tension that started in chapter 1 with Naomi's tragedy is coming to a resolution in chapter 4. But we also notice a new genre in chapter 4, in the final few verses. So what is that genre that we come up against in those last verses? Genealogy, yes. So at the very end, starting kind of in verse 17, the historical narrative shifts to a genealogy. In our Bible school, we do a lot of out loud reading of scripture, and these are the chapters that our students dread falling on their rotation, that they have to read a genealogy, because these are very ancient long names that are hard to pronounce. But because we're hitting a new genre, I do want to just point out two things about this genre, okay? The first is, you may have noticed when you were reading the Bible that when you come across a genealogy, if you took the time to read through it, you may have noticed that almost exclusively these genealogies are male names. They're tracing fathers and sons. Have you guys noticed this when you've come across a genealogy in the Bible? We're not reading about daughters or wives, almost never. And the reason for this is because in Israel, inheritance and tribal identity is only passed on from father to son. So for example, if I were a young woman in Israel and I were to get married to a man from another tribe, I would cease to belong to my father's tribe, and now I would become part of that tribe. So for example, I'm no longer from Judah, now I'm from Benjamin. So for women, their tribal identity was actually flexible, depending on what household they were in. Okay? This is a big reason, if you've ever wondered, why daughters, for the most part, did not inherit land. Sometimes they did, but mostly they did not. Because what would happen if you were a daughter, you inherited land, and then you married a man from another tribe? Now that tribe has land in your tribe, and it creates a lot of conflict among these tribal boundaries. So land and inheritance was always tracked through fathers and sons. This is why when the biblical authors write a genealogy, they're only concerned with the male line. It's not because the women were not seen as valuable or important, but because they're concerned with whose tribe do you come from and where is the land going. Does that make sense, that reasoning? The second thing to know about genealogies in the Bible is that they are often condensed, meaning they're not exhaustive. Every single name is not always mentioned. You see this in the book of Matthew, chapter 1, which we're going to look at later tonight, the genealogy of Jesus. The authors aren't so concerned that every single person is named. So sometimes they're condensed. They're made a little bit shorter. Any questions on that, genealogies? Yeah. Yeah, so essentially what would happen is Naomi and Ruth are not inheriting the land. The parcel of land mentioned in chapter 4, first of all, it's referring to farmland, so out in the fields, kind of like where Boaz is in chapter 2, farming the fields. Elimelech would have owned a piece of land out there. And once Elimelech and his sons die, technically that land is not inherited by Naomi or Ruth. Until a male actually purchases the land, that would be seen as actually buying it back into the family. That doesn't mean that the money for the land wouldn't go to Naomi. In this case, actually, some historians are trying to piece together land laws, and they think actually this would have probably been considered technically the money should go to Naomi to take care of her. However, she wouldn't be considered the primary owner or inheritor of the land. So the land would have essentially been lost to their family had no man stepped in to buy the land. It would have sort of died with that family, and then, been lost to the family line. Yeah, that's a great question.
I'm just curious, how it was recorded, the genealogy, is there a way from the Bible perspective how it was traced?
The author?
Yeah. Like a myth, or is it evidential?
Oh, right. So your ancestry, which line you came from, would have been very, very significant, especially in the ancient world, I think more so to today. So that would have been something your family would have preserved and documented. We aren't as interested in family trees as an ancient Israelite. And so, yeah, when you look at these genealogies, this is something that the families would all have known. These would have been names that they would have been familiar with, that they're documenting. Yeah. Because that's how you know whose land belongs to who and which tribe you belong to.
So
Yeah.
you mean documented in the way it was written on the scribe or something?
Yeah, right. Like in the case of Ruth, documented. In other cases, orally, like oral tradition, passed down. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. All right, so step 4 is history. And hopefully by now you guys are kind of getting familiar with how setting and culture can impact the way we read these stories and help them come to life. Tonight, I have just 2 pieces of like cultural background for us that I think will help us understand chapter 4. The first thing that we need to talk about is the city gate. I know this is really gripping stuff. You probably need to hold back your excitement about hearing about ancient city gates. But you probably noticed that in chapter 4, most of this story is taking place at the city gate. So Boaz has business to take care of, and where does he go? He goes down to the city gate of Bethlehem. And the reason he does this is because the city gate in the ancient world was the hub of urban life. So if you wanted to find anyone, you would go to the city gate. And in a town as small as Bethlehem, it wouldn't take you long to find the person you were looking for, because every day, every person had to go through that gate. Whether it was a farmer going out to the fields, a shepherd bringing his herds out to find pasture, a woman getting water, everyone goes through the city gate. And because of that, this was like the public square of the town. This is where announcements were made, this is where business transactions happened, and this is also where court cases were held. So there was actually a seat for the governor at the city gate where he would come, he would sit, and he would listen to the cases and the litigation happening in his town. And archaeologists have discovered quite a few city gates, and they noticed that there were benches lining the inside of the gate for elders or witnesses to sit and hear what was happening. And that's actually what we see happen in chapter 4, right? Boaz is going to gather the elders and have them sit and witness this transaction. Because the city gate is so prominent in the ancient world, you actually are going to read about it a lot in your Bible. So there's 2 examples. This first one comes from Proverbs 31. This is where the famous Proverbs 31 woman is described. And it says about her that her husband is respected at the city gate, where he takes his seat among the elders of the land. This would be a place of authority and prominence. Another time the city gate is mentioned is in Amos. The Lord is speaking to his people and he says, hate evil, love good, establish justice in the gate, right? And that's because the gate actually functioned like a courthouse. So when he says establish justice in the gate, it's a way of saying in your courts. So this is the setting of chapter 4. Does anyone have any burning questions about city gates in the ancient world? Yes, oh.
Did they have any synagogues or tabernacle at that time?
So at the time period of the Judges, the tabernacle was built, and it was located, I believe, in Shiloh at this time. So Jerusalem was not yet the capital city. Now, Bethlehem's very close to Jerusalem, so Bethlehem's soon going to become a very important town. Right now, not so much. But there was the tabernacle that people could sort of travel to. The synagogue was not yet invented. Invented's probably the wrong word. The synagogues pop up probably during the time of the exile, yeah. Okay, the second final thing we need to talk about as far as background is we need to talk about the sandal in chapter 4, you know? So if you look with me in verse 8 of chapter 4, it says, when the Redeemer said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, he drew off his sandal. Makes total sense. Now, did you guys notice that even the author of Ruth has to sort of explain the sandal thing? Look at verse 7. The author says, now this was the custom in former times in Israel. See how he says that? So even the author of Ruth is writing at a time where he's like, I don't even think my readers are going to know this sandal situation. I need to kind of explain it, right? So what's going on with this sandal? Most likely, this tradition comes from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 25. And if you came to our previous classes, the first part of this law is going to already be familiar to you, okay? And I'm going to read to you starting in verse 5. The law goes like this. If brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside the family. Her husband's brother shall take her and marry her and fulfill the duty of the brother-in-law to her. The first son she bears shall carry on the name of the dead brother so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. You guys familiar with this law? David shared a little bit about it. This is the Levirate law. Very strange to us, very foreign to our culture. But again, the purpose is not only to care for the widow, but to preserve the name and the inheritance of the dead brother, okay? But what happens if the brother says, no, thank you, I'd rather not, okay? So we're gonna keep reading. However, if the man does not want to marry his brother's wife, she shall go to the elders at the town gate. So there's our city gate again. And she shall say, my husband's brother refuses to carry on his brother's name in Israel. He will not fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to me. Then the elders of the town shall summon him and talk to him. So they're trying to persuade him to take on his responsibility. If he persists in saying, I do not want to marry her, his brother's widow shall go up to him in the presence of the elders, take off one of his sandals, spit in his face, and say, this is what is done to the man who will not build up his brother's family line. That man shall be known in Israel as the family of the unsandaled. Don't you guys love the Old Testament? It's the family of the unsandaled. Yeah, I know. Talk about a stigma. Yeah. I love this stuff. This is what we're talking about when we say that the Bible is cross-cultural, right? Not all of it is so relatable to us with these traditions. Okay, so what most scholars believe is happening is that the sandal is really a representative of the rights to the inheritance. And so what you're actually looking at is a transfer of rights. In the case of Deuteronomy 25, the brother is having the right of inheritance stripped from him. The spitting in the face really doesn't need much explanation. I feel like that's pretty cross-cultural. We can kind of get the idea, the sentiment behind that. Now, you guys may notice this isn't exactly what happens in Ruth 4, right? Not exactly. There's no spitting in Ruth chapter 4. The man's sandal is not ripped from him. He takes it off and gives it to Boaz. So this is not exactly what's happening in Ruth 4, but there's so much overlap that it's no doubt that this is most likely the source of that tradition. And what we're looking at in Ruth 4 is a public transfer of rights from one man to Boaz. Okay? Questions on sandals? Probably can't answer them, but do you see the kind of pretty clear connection between Deuteronomy 25 and the scene that plays out in Ruth 4? Not exactly the same, but so similar that this is probably a connected scene. Yeah? Mm-hmm. Say that one more time. An oath. Yeah, I mean, it's a public declaration because it says the elders are there, you're in the town square, and you're publicly saying, hey, I'm forfeiting my rights to this inheritance and either giving it back to the woman or in this case to Boaz, who is going to take the responsibility. Yeah. So it is sort of a public declaration, and in that way you could compare it to an oath. Yeah, can't take it back after that moment. Mm-hmm. So in the case of Ruth, there is no other brother. So in Ruth, which is interesting, is technically both, the brother has died as well. There's two boys. Ruth's husband dies, the brother dies. So is Boaz really responsible? Is this other man really responsible according to the law? Not directly, you're not the brother, but you are a relative. So it's another matter of the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. Yeah, having a wife already might be one main reason. You're like, no, thank you. My wife would be very upset. Yeah. Oh, good question. Yeah, we're going to get into that. Yeah, we're going to get into that. Okay, actually, we're going to get into that right now. So you guys are going to observe. We have colored pencils out for you guys to use. This is when you guys get into the text yourself and slow down, notice the details. For tonight, I've chosen just 2 observations that I want you guys to look for, but please feel free, if you see something that you think is interesting, a detail, mark it down, write it down, we can talk about it. There's a lot of stuff in this chapter. I'm just choosing 2 observations that I think are significant, okay? The first thing I want you to look for are reasons. And what I mean by that is I want you to look through this chapter and look for any time a character gives a reason or a motivation as to why they're acting that way. I'm making this decision because of this. Here is why I am acting in this way. So you're going to look for words like because or in order to or for, okay? Reasons. What motivations are given by the characters? You're probably going to find this in the dialogue of the chapter. And then the second thing I want you to look for are blessings. So there's a series of blessings in chapter 4, specifically between verses 11 through 17. So take notice of those. What blessings are given? What's actually being spoken out over Boaz and Ruth and their family? Okay? So that's the only 2 things I'm going to guide you in. Again, feel free to notice whatever is standing out to you. I'll give you some time to do that, and then we'll see what you guys were finding. Okay? Any questions? All right, go for it. I apologize if that's not quite enough time. I know we always rush you. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is hear from you guys what you noticed, what you observed, and I'm just going to open it up. It could be one of these two things. It could be something you found on your own. I just ask that when you share, just tell us what verse you're getting it from. That way we can all follow along, and for those watching online, they can follow along too. So what are some things you guys were observing? Mhm.
Boaz is a pretty good guy. He's a righteous guy.
He is a pretty good guy. We like Boaz.
And he's probably a hero without knowing.
He's probably a hero without knowing. He does rank pretty high in this story for me as well. Yeah. And chapter 4, we're going to talk about a little bit later. He really steps up. Yeah. Boaz is a good guy. I agree. Yeah, I know. It is. He's decent. Yeah.
It's like a package deal. When you buy something, it's like a chain reaction. You need to buy the rest.
Okay, yeah. So you're noticing that first paragraph?
Yes, it's on what this Redeemer said. I think it's on verse 9.
Uh-huh.
All the have bought from the hand of Naomi all the belongings to Elimelech, and all the belongings to Chilion and Mahlon,
Mm-hmm.
also Ruth the Moab. So it's all like when you buy something, it's like package deal.
Yeah, so
Buy
yeah.
this, you know.
Yeah, so we notice that Boaz makes a point, first of all, of when he's talking with the Redeemer, first he mentions just what? Just the land. No mention of Ruth. Later, he brings in, oh, by the way, when you get the land, Ruth, the Moabite, you'll marry her. I know you'll do the right thing, marry her as well. Yeah, that he connects them. Yeah, good. That's great. Great point. Yeah.
I got the impression he was like saying, but you gotta take this too, as if he kind of knew he wasn't going to do it.
You feel like there's a bit of a setup.
Kind of a setup, yeah.
Yeah, because he doesn't mention anything about Ruth at first. Hey, we've got this land. It's up for sale. You have first dibs. Do you want it? Definitely. Oh, and also, yeah. Also, it's very public. So I do think there's a bit of putting this guy on the spot. That's kind of the impression that I'm getting, yeah. Yeah. And we can talk about that a little bit. Why does he mention the land first, then include Ruth? Only after he says, yeah, I want the land. Yeah, it's good. What about the reasons? What like motivations were you reading about? And did anyone see any reasoning, motivations in the dialogue? Yeah, Joseph?
I thought it was interesting when the guy who's the Redeemer, he brings up why he can't take the land all of a sudden.
Yeah.
He says, lest I impair my own inheritance. And I wonder if that's maybe there's a translation that is able to indicate what that is exactly, like whether it be, like was brought up earlier, like when maybe he has a wife or something like that, or he doesn't bring that up until after the reason.
Yeah, so do you guys notice his response? I cannot, lest I impair my own inheritance. That's actually going to be one of our first interpretation questions. What does that mean? He says, oh, I can't do that unless I basically jeopardize my inheritance if I marry Ruth. So we're going to ask that question. Yeah, it's really good. Anything else?
I think the reason of getting all this package deal is to not to cut off the dead relative.
Yeah, that's the other big reason, right? So look at verse 5. When Boaz says, you must marry Ruth, the Moabite, in order to what? What's the reason? Oh, so that you can perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. This is the reason you should also marry Ruth. Yeah, this is the reason he gives. Yeah, good. What about the blessings? Did you guys notice anything? Or, yeah. Mhm.
Boaz did what he did because in chapter 3, verse 13, he said, remain tonight
Yeah. There's his oath. Yeah, so Uncle Les was connecting this back to chapter 3 when Boaz is with Ruth. Boaz makes her a promise and says, tomorrow I'm going to find this man, and if he refuses you, what does it say? As the Lord, how does he phrase it? He brings in the Lord. As the Lord lives, that's an oath. He makes an oath to her, I will redeem you if this man will not. Yeah, that's a great connection. Yeah, very good. Uh-huh. Yeah, really good. So this is another reason. So when in verse 10, when Boaz purchases the land, he's going to marry Ruth. He says that this is going to keep Boaz's previous husband's name from being cut off in the land. And so this has a lot to do with sort of like your memory, your name living on, which also would have been very, very highly valued. I think it is today, but more so in the ancient world. This idea of your memory, your name, your line, your inheritance. And so Boaz gives that as one of his reasons for marrying Ruth in chapter 4. Yeah, really good. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh.
Chapter 3 is this
Uh-huh.
Naomi's motive of telling.
Oh, you're back to the threshing floor.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so Naomi, it's like this preparation for yeah, it's like an ambush to me.
Oh.
Like, because Naomi said on chapter 3, wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matters turns out, for the man will not rest,
Yeah.
will settle the matter today. So
Yeah.
it's this the
Yeah.
reaction.
Yeah, this is her plan. Yeah, she's involved. Naomi's involved. She's pulling some strings here. Yeah, she's not a bystander in the story. She is actively involved. Everything is going according to plan. Yeah, right. Yeah. No, of course. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah, right. Naomi's the one who first says, oh, hey, he's a redeemer, right? So Naomi's kind of this gateway to the culture. She knows the laws of Israel and this redemptive law, and that this might actually lead to marriage. Yeah, that's good. Okay, we're kind of, yeah, Dad.
I'm kind of blown away by this family connection and the level or the
Yeah, that's a good point. Often when we think of caring for those who are vulnerable, it is sort of at a gift level, which of course not all of us are called to enter into marriage as the solution, but this is a change your life scenario. And so when we're talking about this one redeemer who turns Ruth down, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, he's faced with his entire life being changed. Not just with marriage, but with children. This is his whole future shifting. And so we don't want to take that lightly either. This is a big decision. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Almost like a signature or a symbol. Mm-hmm. It's a great perspective. It's definitely weird. Yeah. Yeah, so I actually think the business deal analogy is more like what's happening. We don't like to think of that because it has to do with marriage, and so it's less like a court case and more like a business deal, and these elders there are witnessing it so that they can hold them later accountable. I saw it, what happened. You gave up your right to this land. Yeah, absolutely. I really like that way of understanding the sandal. What's that? Oh, Naomi? Ambush, yeah, right. This is where they were hoping this would head. Yeah, to a marriage at the city gate, yeah. It's good. Okay, we have to keep moving. We're already interpreting, so we'll just do it officially. So we're going to interpret. So what does this all mean? What's going on? Why is it happening? What's the significance? I hope you guys understand that although we are picking questions for you for the sake of just guiding the discussion, if you were at home, this would be the time in your study where you would just start to ask why questions. Why does Boaz go to the city gate? Why does he get 10 elders? Why does he talk about the land first and then Ruth? You just start asking why questions about every verse. So hopefully we're not limiting you. Just for this study, David and I pick questions that we think are interesting. But in your study, this is really easy. You just ask why. Why is this happening? Why is it significant? Okay? So Joseph brought up a great point that I want to ask about. So at this moment in our story, Boaz is at the city gate. We don't know how long he waits, but eventually the closer redeemer comes through. He pulls him aside, gathers the elders, and then in a very public moment, he makes the proposition. There's land, it's for sale, you have rights to it over me. Do you want to buy it? And immediately, the redeemer says, I will buy it. Then Boaz says, oh, by the way, if you buy this land, you also marry Ruth, the Moabite, the widow, so that the name of her dead husband is not cut off. And the man's response is really interesting. He says, I cannot because it would impair my inheritance, okay? So my question is just why? Why does the closer redeemer accept the land but turn down the marriage? Why would this impair his inheritance? So I want you guys to think about what we've learned from the cultural background these last few weeks and help that inform your decision of like your answer. Why does he feel like his own inheritance is being threatened by marrying this woman? Okay, so take a minute. If you don't have anyone at your table, maybe like just shift around, find someone to chat with, and see what you think. Okay, who wants to start us off? Let's hear an interpretation. What do you think's going on? Okay. Yeah, okay, so when we read the word redeem, it is very difficult to not immediately think of the redemption on the cross, which we will definitely talk about before the night is done. Yeah, that word redeem is so powerful in our Christian tradition because it's going to be used later on by God himself to describe what he's done for us. So what we're seeing is the human version of redemption, the ancient historical version of redemption. What Boaz did at the gate was redeem Ruth. Now we're going to talk about later, God's going to take that word and say, and that's what I've done for you. Yeah. So that's a great connection, and one we can't help but make, right? When we hear redeem, we immediately think of the cross. Yeah, great point. Yeah, okay, good. Okay, great. So, two things. One, is this guy actually a brother? No, neither men are a brother of the man who died. So, Ruth's husband, his name's Mahlon. Mahlon only had one brother, Chilion. They both die in chapter 1. So, these guys are just distant relatives. We don't know how distant they are. They're just relatives. So, again, the social pressure is kind of off of them a little bit. There might be a bit of a moral obligation. Hey, you have a relative to take care of, but it's not so strong as a brother's wife would be, okay? And then you bring up the fact that she's a Moabite. Did some of you guys also talk about this at your tables, how this might influence his decision? We don't know for sure, but it is interesting that Boaz specifically calls her a Moabite, and he has not done that yet in this book. So he says, oh, you have to marry Ruth, the Moabite. Does that factor into his decision? We don't actually know, but we do know from background that the Moabites have a very bad reputation in Israel. As a nation, as a people group, Israel and the Moabites have a very negative history, and so that could factor in. I don't want the stigma of a Moabite wife. I don't want that reputation. It is possible this also impacted his decision. Now, that wouldn't necessarily impair his inheritance, but it might be a motivation, I would say. I think that's a fair interpretation. Yeah. Did anyone have a different theory of what he's talking about there with his inheritance? Why is his inheritance in jeopardy? He's in love with another woman, and he was on his way to propose, and Boaz got in the way. This is like the backstory of Ruth, you know?
We talk about maybe that Redeemer has a son already.
Say that again. Okay.
And if he's gonna marry Ruth, there's gonna be another son.
Uh-huh.
It's kind of like a conflict.
It's kind of like a conflict.
Yes.
It is.
He might impair his inheritance. Maybe it didn't mention. We talked about it.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, okay, so here we are, ancient culture. We talked about in week 2, I think, or 3. This is a subsistence culture, meaning people are just barely making it every year, right? Every harvest, you just get enough food to survive. And this man is faced with not only taking on Naomi, an extra mouth to feed, but a wife, or maybe a second wife, to take care of. And not only that, but if she does have a son, that's not technically his descendant, but the descendant of her dead husband's line, which means that the inheritance that he would be getting actually is going to go to that son. So all of the land that he buys actually is going to go to that son and be considered Elimelech's property. So in his mind, buying the field, that's a good business deal, right? I'm gonna buy the field. Naomi doesn't have any children, so everything I get from that land goes to my family. Once Ruth is involved, we have the potential of a son. And that means that this inheritance would actually go to that family line. Very ancient way of thinking, but it's interesting because he's interested when it benefits himself, but later on when Ruth is involved, he's not so interested. Yeah, Zach. It's good.
And then Boaz, by contrast, his inheritance then becomes like a part of the land. So like by another instance of like by adhering to God's law, like you get true inheritance that you really want, not just like property.
Yeah. Yeah, well said. That's a really great point. And to kind of go off of that, something that's interesting that a lot of commentators note about this guy is that he isn't named in the chapter, and that's actually odd. So he's either called the Redeemer, or if you look in verse 1, Boaz calls him friend. So that's an interesting translation. The word is not friend, okay? The word is actually, and I'm probably going to pronounce this wrong, but paloni almoni. It's this rhyming word in Hebrew, and it literally would translate to our version of Joe Schmo, or so-and-so, whoever. It's this sort of term for whatever his name is, like anonymous. So it's not friend, it's like our English Joe Schmo. And I think it's interesting that this one character that's like, no, I care about my inheritance, his name is forgotten in the story. But Boaz, right, who steps up, has a name that's remembered forever because of his act. There's a quote I love from Marian Ann Taylor, and she's playing off of this Joe Schmo translation. She said, while Joe Schmo was interested in redeeming Naomi's land for financial gain only, Boaz entered into the agreement to purchase land and marry Ruth for reasons that go beyond the requirements of the law. So again, we see Boaz sort of stepping up and taking care of the widow. Okay, we need to move on. So next question I want you guys to discuss in your groups is I want you to talk about the significance of the blessings in chapter 4. So if you didn't get a chance to observe these when you were going through the text earlier, you can find them in verses 11 through 17. And I want to ask, what is the significance of these blessings, and how do they contrast with the tragedy of chapter 1? So the blessings of chapter 4 with the tragedies of chapter 1. So why are these blessings significant? If you have a trouble like finding the blessings, just let me know and I'll point them out to you. So I'll give you a few minutes. Go ahead and discuss with a neighbor. Oh, yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is great. Okay, so we have the marriage, and then things like are condensed a lot in verses 13 through 17. So Ruth conceives, and she has a son, which in any situation would be considered this is a blessing. But I also want to add to that if you go back to chapter 1, Ruth was married before for 10 years without a child. So a lot of people will read this story and see that also as like the hand of God, like a supernatural, almost like a miracle here in the last chapter of the story, because it's possible that there's a reason why she didn't have a child those first 10 years. And the women mention that the Lord gave her conception. This is probably how they would talk about it in the ancient world for any conception, like this is the hand of the Lord, this is a blessing. But yeah, I think that's a great point to make. And obviously it contrasts with chapter 1 with Naomi and the loss of her 2 sons. And then now we have Obed. Yeah, great connection. Yeah. Mm-hmm. David.
Talked about briefly was that you said the contrast in chapter 1 where Naomi pretty much, her outlook on life is like, my life is over, so Ruth, don't even bother. And then at the end, it's kind of like, oh, he's going to actually be a restorer. So it's like her life in the beginning, from her perspective, was over, but now her life is being restored through the birth of this son. And I also like how it says, nourish her in your old age. I think it's a pretty powerful line. And also, Joe, I think it's interesting, the reason in verse 15, for your daughter-in-law, Ruth, who again, who loves you, is more to you than 7 sons, which is kind of an interesting comparison, because you're like, the whole thing is about the importance of a son, and they're like, Ruth is better than 7 of them. So it doesn't
Yeah. Yeah, great. Yeah, that's really good. That phrase, he shall be to you a restorer of life, I feel like that could almost be a picture of the book of Ruth. Her life was sort of destroyed in chapter 1, and then here it's like her life is being restored. She says in chapter 1, I am empty. And then here, the women who she said that to are now telling her, your life is restored. Yeah, it's this reversal we see. Great. Yeah, what else were you guys noticing? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, yeah, so we have these blessings, and if you could summarize a lot of these blessings, what are they? That you would be prominent in Israel, that you would be like these mothers, Rachel, Leah, Tamar, and they're famous for giving birth to sons who became prominent leaders in Israel. Are their blessings fulfilled? Well, in the genealogy, right away we see those blessings come true. We don't have to wait to find out that Ruth is not just going to be a mother of a son, but she's going to be the mother of a dynasty that will lead to the greatest king in Israelite history. So immediately we see these blessings come true from that genealogy. Just like Leah and Rachel gave birth to the 12 sons of Israel, and just like Tamar gave birth to the beginning of the tribe of Judah, Ruth gives birth to a son that leads to King David. So we see, yeah, those blessings are actually very prophetic blessings over this child. Yeah, it's a great point. One thing I want to point out before we move on is this could just be my interpretation, but I think the fact that the city of Bethlehem, the elders, bless Ruth by saying, hey, may you be like Leah, and Rachel. To me, that really signals her acceptance into the community, that she's not an outsider anymore. They're actually wishing that she would be like two of the great women of their country, right? The matriarchs of Israel. And that's not something you would say to an outsider. It seems like they've really fully embraced her. And so I see a bit of an arc for Ruth. She started out as this outsider, and here in chapter 4, she's embraced and actually compared to some of these great women in Israel's history. Oh, yeah, about 6 weeks. Yeah, so from the time Naomi and Ruth get into Bethlehem to now, it's about 6 weeks. And the reason we know that is just the harvest, the length of time of the harvest would take to complete. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, sorry. No, 6 weeks. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah. 6 weeks.
So probably they'll announce him, maybe like the announcement, you having the son from when you came with nothing to you have a son.
Yeah. 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 A year. Yeah.
Such a transformative, generationally transformative
Yeah.
that God did through relationships.
Yeah. Yeah, and you imagine like Naomi or Ruth in chapter 1, if they had known, hey, within 1 year's time, your life is going to be so radically different, like the blessings you're going to have in a year, the favor that you're going to have in a year, your life is transformed. I'm sure they would not believe it. So yeah, I like that, just that time frame of how quickly their stories are shifted in the course of, 6 weeks is really when things are restored, and then, yeah, to the end of a year. Yeah, that's a great point. Mm-hmm.
Your daughter-in-law, the woman speaks to Naomi, your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Like, is the picture that Naomi's like better off than she was when her husband or 2 sons are alive? I feel like the fact that her 2 sons like literally died, I feel like that's kind of a bold statement to be like, oh yeah, she's better than like 7. I don't know.
Yeah, I wouldn't take that statement to be a comparison to the 2 sons she lost, and more as a set saying. So that phrase, 7 sons, you find it in Kings and Samuel. 7 is like the perfect number, 7 sons, what could be better? So more of just a phrase that you would use to say that she's so valuable to you, it's like 7 sons, as opposed to a statement of maybe what she lost. I can see how it could seem a little bit almost like insensitive, but I think that it's almost like a set phrase of honor, of like, this is how much she's worth to you. And the best thing an ancient person could think of, 7 sons. What could be better than 7 sons? Ruth could be better than 7 sons. Yeah. Yeah, it's a good point. All right, last question. You guys ready? It's 8:30, almost. How are we doing? One more. Okay, we have to talk a little bit about the genealogy. So my question for you, it's pretty broad. Why is it significant that the book of Ruth ends in this genealogy? And if I could ask you, when you're discussing with the people around you, to go ahead and open up Matthew chapter 1 and compare the genealogy. So Matthew 1 is the genealogy of Jesus. And I want you to kind of glance at that as you're discussing. Why is it significant that Ruth ends in this genealogy? Compare with the one in Matthew chapter 1. So it's a pretty broad question on purpose. I just want you to discuss what you think the significance is, and then we will wrap up. Together. Does someone want to share something they were discussing at their tables? Yeah.
I was just going to say that it's kind of neat that his lineage came from Moabite. I mean, talk about God's power to the extent where it wasn't like, just came just from left field. God's power is so great, you can just bring someone from way out here to be at this point.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, well said. That's beautiful. And it's not hidden as well, the fact that in David's genealogy and in the genealogy of Christ, it is almost given a spotlight, both by the book of Ruth and then Matthew chapter 1, where Ruth is named. So yeah, this ancestry of Moabite blood that runs through David, through Jesus, is almost, showcased, which is interesting. Yeah.
Jesus is almost like a Samaritan. Except Samaritans were Syrian Jews.
Right, yeah, not pure.
Jesus was Moabite.
Yeah, so what you read when you read Matthew is that the bloodline includes not just Ruth, but Tamar, who is a Canaanite, right? These are foreign, and Rahab, so 3 foreign women in the genealogy. And again, they're mentioned, which again makes you think maybe it's not all about the race of like the Israelite ethnicity. There's something bigger going on than just for one specific race. Yeah, that's good. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's not about where she was from, and we see that in chapter 2 of Ruth, where Boaz looks and says, I've heard about you. You're a worthy woman. You're a woman of integrity. And he takes interest in her because of her character, not necessarily the country that she came from, which is also the case for Rahab. Yeah. Kate, tell us more about that. Yeah, so did you guys pick up on Boaz's family lineage when you were looking at the genealogy? So this is the first time in Ruth that we actually realize, like, oh, who Boaz's family is, right? And we see that he is the son of Salmon, who is the husband of Rahab. Okay, so Rahab, famous Canaanite prostitute in the city of Jericho, who joins the people of Israel. And so a good question to ask when you have more time is, how would that have impacted the type of man that Boaz was? To have someone so close. Yeah, there's a God-honoring woman who's a foreigner in his family. That would maybe explain some of his actions towards Ruth. Here's another foreign woman, but also a woman of good character who's following the Lord. He's disposed to actually take interest in her. Now, we don't know that till the end, right? Up until the end of the book, all we know is he's a relative of Elimelech. And at the end, we realize, oh, this is a descendant of Rahab. So you know that would have impacted him, his story, the way he viewed foreign women, especially. So yeah, it's an interesting connection to make when we're talking about the character of Boaz. Yeah, it's good. Yeah. Yeah, and so it's not, yeah. Yeah, so if a woman's name is included, it makes you must ask why, because that is not normal. So in the genealogy of Jesus, when you see a woman's name, you know that's not normal. They're being included to send a message, to show you something. There are 4 women named in the genealogy of Jesus. Each of their stories are found in the Bible. Each of their stories are complicated, right? They have sort of complex pasts. And yet, again, they get a spotlight in the genealogy of Jesus. Ruth is one of them. Yeah. Good. Yeah. Which again tells the message it's not about your bloodline, right? Yeah. So personally, I think it's supposed to be a bit of a climax at the end of the story. Like you think these are just about your everyday people, it's a cute story, and then all of a sudden you get to the end and it's almost like a reveal. Like, oh, this marriage these people that we've come to love, Ruth and Boaz, this isn't just a story about average everyday people anymore. All of a sudden the story is elevated, right? Because it's actually about a genealogy of a king. And King David. So I think it's put at the end as a way, almost like a surprise for readers, because everyone reading this book would know who King David is. And so you see this like elevation. Something that stood out to me when I was looking at the Matthew 1 genealogy is I've heard this illustration that when you're reading a genealogy, it's almost like looking at a tapestry. You're getting this big picture of thousands of years, hundreds of lives, and it's almost like each life is like a thread being woven together. And I think with the story of Ruth and Boaz, you read it and it seems so small. You have a farmer and a widow in the time period of the judges, and everything they're doing seems so, minor. And I feel like what Matthew 1 does is it zooms us out to see the big picture. That in their small, everyday faithfulness, God is actually weaving them into this larger story of redemption for the whole world. And I think that's encouraging for us in our lives when we're going about things that seem small, that seem insignificant, that the faithfulness in the steady, everyday things that we do, God is using in larger ways that we may not ever see, right? Like Ruth and Boaz most likely did not live to see David become king, right? This is too far in the future. They never saw that happen in their lifetime. And much less than that, they would have no idea that their descendants would eventually lead to the Messiah. But they were faithful with what they'd been given. As we move into application, I want to read this quote. I thought it was really beautiful. It's by Elizabeth Charles. And she's writing about the book of Ruth, and she says, so this old story of Bethlehem ends with joy in a birth, and the name of Ruth, daughter of the outcast nation, and of Naomi, widowed and childless, are engraved in the pedigree of the Son of Man, through whom none are outcasts, and in whom are no desolate hearts. And I thought that was really beautiful. We're going to shift to our last application. We're going to do something a little bit different tonight. We're not just applying chapter 4, but we're actually looking at the whole book. We finished the book of Ruth, and as one unified piece, what is this teaching us today? What does this ancient little book have to speak to our lives right now? So I'm going to share with you 4 things that I saw through this book that have impacted me, and then I would love for you guys to share with one another some takeaways that you have, what the Holy Spirit has been highlighting to you. It could be from tonight, it could be from some of the other nights you've come from this book. So for me, there were kind of 4 things that really stood out to me as this is it for me when I think of Ruth. And the first is how God works on earth through his people. He works on earth through his people, and we see this in Boaz specifically. God cares about the widow. God cares about the orphan. God cares about those who are foreign or vulnerable. And how does he choose to care for them? Through his people. And so in Ruth, we see this picture of a widow being cared for both by the Lord, but through the actions of Boaz. And so what this book has done for me is challenged me to not just pray for God to do something, but to ask, how can I partner with you in what you want to see done in my community, right? How can I actually be the answer to the things that I am praying for in my world, in my everyday life, in my sphere? The second thing, and this is something that Ruth, I think, demonstrates best in this book, is her faithful love towards others. Even when it could have cost her everything, she sticks by Naomi with a kind of loyal love that honestly, at this time period in history, put God's people to shame. The amount of loyalty and integrity she showed as a foreigner was greater than the average Israelite at this time. And there's a quote from a commentator on the book of Ruth that I love, Darrell Block. He said, more than anyone else, this is a big statement, he said, more than anyone else in the history of Israel, Ruth embodies the fundamental principle of this nation's ethic. You shall love God with all your heart, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Ironically, it is this stranger from Moab who shows the Israelites what this means. And it's a big statement, and I thought about it. At first, I was like, I don't know about that. And the more I thought about it, the more I was like, yeah, this is true. She's showing this radical, faithful love to Naomi despite opposition, and it's really beautiful and challenging for us in our relationships with the people around us. Number 3, care for the weak and the oppressed. This is all over the book of Ruth. The people of God are called to care for the vulnerable, and Ruth has this theme running throughout it from beginning to end. God cares about the vulnerable. God's people should care about the vulnerable. And God's people should use the influence they have on behalf of those who maybe don't have a voice, don't have an influence. And we see this again through Boaz in both chapter 2 and then again in chapter 4, where he speaks up on behalf of Ruth. Because I think we all know that one redeemer, Joe Schmo, could have gotten away with just buying the land and forgetting about Ruth if it wasn't for Boaz standing publicly and saying, what about Ruth? You need to marry Ruth too. So he used his influence to take care of someone who really didn't have a voice in that society. And then last, we see in the book of Ruth very ordinary lives that are lived with exceptional integrity. And I think that this is encouraging to us who are not kings or queens or rulers of nations, which a lot of books in the Bible are about, but these are everyday people who are just doing what's in front of them, the next thing they're asked to do with integrity. And as I was putting this together, Dave and I were talking about the applications, and on Sunday last week, Pastor was talking about just ways that this church have gotten involved in the local community. And it really reminded me of a lot of things that we read about in Ruth, right? Like, I'm gonna be a light to the people around me, right? And so there's a lot of open doors right now with this school, and there's a lot of people, some in this room, that have really poured into kids' lives here through things that may seem small, like playing chess, playing volleyball, like sports, community gardens. It's like, well, I'm not changing a nation. It's just doing something small that I can do that's in my sphere. And what I love about Ruth is it says, hey, that's it. That's okay if that's all you're doing, is the small thing that God's asking you to do that's right in front of you. God's going to use that. So, I was just encouraging to be studying this book, and then on Sunday hearing about just the ways that this church family is doing that in our community. And I love that. So, I do apologize. We are running late. I knew we would. I told David I knew we would tonight. Would you just take a few minutes and maybe just share something with the person around you that you have gotten from the book? It could be something up here. It could be something totally personal to you. But yeah, just take a minute or two and do that with the person next to you. Yes. Yes. No, no.
Aside from wrapping everything up right here,
Yeah.
the writer doesn't mention anything about Boaz in the last portion of the story. In other words, Boaz doesn't have the opportunity to say, "Hey."
Oh, It goes right to the women of the story. Yeah.
It really goes to the community are saying, "You're so blessed, Naomi." But Boaz is saying,
Yeah, we don't get any reaction. Wouldn't you like one?
"Yeah."
I'd like to know what he was thinking. Yeah.
I mean, I would think the writer would include that
Yeah.
because he's a sub-hero.
Yeah, he's one of the major characters of the book. You don't get a reaction. Yeah, it's the community. You get the elders, you get the women of the neighborhood. Ruth doesn't say anything either. Neither does Naomi. It's the community that actually speaks at the end of the book, which is interesting to think about. Yeah, why?
It's surprising. He kind of disappears, kind of, sort of like Oprah. I mean, that's it.
Yeah, why do you think the author ends with the community and not Ruth or Boaz or Naomi speaking? I haven't thought about this myself, so I don't know. Yeah, I don't.
have no.
I wonder if maybe it's part of that zooming out, like we're about to go to a big genealogy, so maybe I'm totally making this up on the spot, maybe it goes to the community, like a bigger community, and then now here's the genealogy, kind of pulling away from the individual to the group.
Because it's not about the individuals themselves.
Especially at the end, you realize,
So much more. Just a part of it. Just like George Schmoll really doesn't have a voice because it's not that Boaz and Ruth aren't significant, but they're part of the puzzle and we're trying to, I don't know if it's implied that it's bigger than them.
and at the end, it's like, it's actually the community, the nation, like,
30,000 going, whoa, okay.
yeah. And I think you are supposed to, if you read it for the first time, you get to the genealogy and you're like, oh, that's who I've been reading about. Like, this is like David's great-great-grandfather and grandmother. Yeah, like, whoa, I thought this was just about the average person.
That's great. I like that because that's what I'm thinking. I was like, when I read this the first time, it didn't have any significance at all.
Yeah.
Until you go,
It's about some farmers. Yeah.
found their luck family,
Yeah.
a big story of redemption.
Yeah.
Yay, happy ending.
Yeah. And then King of Israel, Messiah. It's just like, oh, okay, yeah.
Be from teacher to student.
Which is cool because then you like you're saying
Be exilic. Could this be an allegory?
right now
Some have taken it to be an allegory, seen it at an allegorical level. And I think the reason is because of that word redeemer. And it's hard to hear the word redeemer, kinsman redeemer, and not think of like a type of Christ.
The reason why is because it's pre-exile.
Yep,
You haven't had the exile yet.
right.
The people haven't gone to the promised land yet. They haven't fought the other nations yet.
Nope, they are in the promised land.
Yeah, well,
But yeah, no,
I
no,
take that back.
yeah.
I mean, you're not fighting the other nations with God on your side,
Right.
right?
Yeah, right.
And then they become stiff-backed,
Yeah, things go downhill.
and then they go down.
Yeah, yeah.
It's just like Naomi and her family were like the diaspora.
Yeah, people have made this connection. People have made the connection, yeah. Allegorized it, yeah.
Is it?
I typically stay away from allegorizing, but I think that depending on when it was written, which people don't know, it could be almost like another level. But I do think it's a real historical story. I do believe Ruth lived. I believe Boaz lived. So I tend to stay away from allegorizing this one. Jonah, maybe, actually. I think there's a case for Jonah, more so than Ruth. I'm not sold yet, but part of me is like, oh, maybe it was kind of a parable, because it's written a little bit like that.
But you're always haunted by the pre-exilic.
Major deal. Yeah, major deal. No, it's a good connection. People have made the same connection. So yeah, you got real smart people that would be like, yeah. All right. Just a couple of closing things I wish we had time to all share. I'd love to hear some things that were standing out to you. But as we close, and again, thank you so much for sticking around. I know it's a little bit over. I did want to end tonight just making the connection with the word redemption. So if you guys remember from the third week together, I shared with you that word redeem is actually not originally a spiritual word or a biblical word. It was actually a common, everyday word in the ancient world. And what it refers to is to buy back, to recover, to redeem, or literally to just buy back. And a redeemer was a family member who would step up to do what was necessary to buy back and make sure a family member was safe and secure. That's what it meant in the ancient world. So what you guys just read about in chapter 4 is Boaz being a redeemer. It's not spiritual, it's just everyday life. They use the word redeemer like we would use any other word. Oh, there's one redeemer who's closer, Boaz is another redeemer. And what we see in chapter 4 as Boaz paying the cost, making a sacrifice in order to bring Ruth into the family and make sure she's cared for. And I have to mention this because it's such a big deal. God specifically chooses to use the word redeem and pull it out of their culture and use it to refer to what he is going to do for us. So he sees this in their culture and he decides to use it to describe what happens on the cross. And so as we close tonight, I have to read this passage from 1 Peter 1:18 through 19. Listen to the words of Peter describing what was done for us on the cross. Peter says, "You were not redeemed with perishable things like silver or gold from your futile ways of life inherited from your forefathers, but you were redeemed with precious blood as of a lamb, unblemished and spotless, the blood of Christ." So in the cross, there is a picture of a father who is paying the price in order to rescue lost family members, to bring them into a family so that they have a home, they have safety, they have a name, they are redeemed, they are bought back. And you cannot talk about this little scene at the city gate with Boaz where he stands up and he says, "I'm going to marry Ruth, even if it jeopardizes my inheritance. I'm going to marry Ruth, I'm going to buy the field so that she has a home." That's the picture God chooses to use to talk about how he bought us back from bondage, from slavery. He rescued us, he redeemed us back into a family. And so we have to talk about that when we talk about the book of Ruth. that redemption, even though it started as this ancient custom, God takes that word and uses it as a picture to describe how he has redeemed us, he's saved us. As a father, he's kind of chased us down, so to speak, in order to rescue us and bring us back into his family. And so I'd encourage you, as you're thinking about the book of Ruth and the word redemption, to just meditate a little bit on how that might change the way you view the cross, the way you view what Jesus did for you. This idea of buying you back into a family where you belong. I'm going to pray and then we will close. Jesus, we love you so much and we're so thankful that we are the redeemed. That's our identity. We are people who were bought back. We were bought with the precious blood of Jesus. We thank you that we were so valuable to you that you were willing to pay the price of your blood to buy us back. I pray that as we leave, we would walk out changed. Pray these things in your name. Amen.
All right. All right, last thing, just a few announcements really quickly. First, I want to thank Pastor Riz and Zach for helping. Zach comes early and sets up all the live stream stuff, so everyone watching online, you can thank Zach. And just for Pastor Riz, making this space available and spending time. I just want to say, I think it's a good thing to find a church where the pastor values God's word. And so I love being at this church with Pastor Riz because he wants the people in this church to know God through his word and study his word. And so it's been really fun to partner with Pastor Riz. And then also, too, we want to send probably an email later at the end of this week or beginning next week for some feedback because we want to hear from you guys. So please, if you can, if you get the email, fill it out. It would be so valuable. Tell us a little bit about your experience, what you learned. We want to hear what God has spoke to you. Any way that this class could have been better facilitated or anything like that, we love constructive feedback. It's okay. Yes. And also, too, we're planning on doing these kind of like quarterly-ish. So if there's like, hey, I would love to have a class on this topic or a class that covers this book, please let us know because we don't want to just be doing stuff that we're like, well, this is fun for us if there's something that a lot of people are interested in. So look out for that email, end of the week, beginning of next week, and have a great week. See you on Sunday.